Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Okay, right off the bat, I want you to try and imagine something for me. Picture a reality completely devoid of any printed matter whatsoever. Just a dark, restricted world with literally no books, no journals, no newspapers, no posters on the street corners, not even a printed calendar hanging on your wall. It's almost impossible for us to picture, right? I mean, we live in this incredibly abundant world of print, and we take it completely for granted today. So you gotta wonder, what's the actual history that shaped the modern world we live in? Well, it turns out the history of print is really the history of the very first information revolution. We're talking about the exact technology that structured our modern minds, completely changed how we interact with authority, and honestly transformed human culture from the ground up. All right, part one, origins of the printed word. If we trace this text's geographic journey along the Silk Road, we actually have to start in China, all the way back around AD 594. Back then, these exceptionally skilled craftsmen printed by rubbing paper against inked woodblocks to create these really cool traditional stitched accordion books. From there, Buddhist missionaries carried that hand printing technology over to Japan in the 8th century. Then, slowly but surely, that knowledge snaked its way into Europe. Chinese papers showed up in the 11th century, but the real game changer was the famous explorer Marco Polo, who brought woodblock knowledge back to Italy in 1295. And that perfectly set the stage for Johann Gutenberg in Strasbourg. In the 1430s, Gutenberg brilliantly adapted the mechanics of an everyday olive press to cast metal types, perfecting the first known mechanical printing press. Think about the absolute night and day difference between the old manuscript culture and the new print culture. Before the press, luxury manuscripts were copied out by hand onto incredibly expensive vellum. They were fragile, awkward to handle, and pretty much restricted entirely to elite aristocratic circles and wealthy monastic libraries. Everyday folks lived in a purely oral culture. They heard sacred text read aloud or they listened to ballads being recited. But then, boom, the revolution hits. Books became cheaper and mass-produced. Almost overnight, we see the emergence of a widespread reading public, and this radical, brand new shift towards silent, individual reading. Moving right along to part two, Gutenberg's European print revolution. The sheer math of this disruption is honestly mind-boggling. As printing presses popped up in most countries across Europe between 1450 and 1550, book production just absolutely exploded. We went from a totally handwritten society to seeing 20 million copies of printed books flood European markets in the second half of the 15th century. And then, by the 16th century, that number jumped to a staggering 200 million copies. That unbelievable leap from hand printing to mechanical printing, that's exactly what the print revolution is all about. Which brings us to part three, religion, rebellion, and revolution. It's wild to think about content going viral centuries before the internet was even a spark of an idea, but that's exactly what happened. In 1517, the religious reformer Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses, basically calling out the rituals of the Roman Catholic Church. His writings were immediately reproduced in massive numbers and read everywhere. His translation of the New Testament sold 5,000 copies in just a few weeks. This explosion of printed debate directly caused a massive division within the church and effectively launched the Protestant Reformation. Luther himself was so deeply grateful for the technology that he literally called printing the ultimate gift of God. So the really crucial takeaway here is that print sparked individual interpretations of faith, and this happened even among working people with very little formal education. Take Minocchio, for example, a 16th century Italian miller. He just started reading whatever books were locally available, totally reinterpreted the Bible, and formulated his very own view of God. Well, this completely enraged the established authorities. The Roman Catholic Church actually hauled him up during the Inquisition and ultimately executed him for his views. Deeply terrified by this new culture of questioning, the church scrambled to regain control by establishing a strict index of prohibited books. But hey, the genie was totally out of the bottle by this point. By the 18th century, there was this widespread, unstoppable conviction that reading could sweep despotism away and truly empower the public. The French novelist Louis Sébastien Mercier captured this energy perfectly when he warned the tyrants of the world to tremble before the virtual writer. People genuinely believed that print would liberate society and usher in an era where intellect and reason ruled supreme. In fact, a lot of historians argue that print literally fueled the French Revolution, and it did this in three major ways. First up, it popularized the rational, logic-based ideas of Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau, which totally eroded the old social order that was based purely on tradition. Second, it created a vibrant new culture of dialogue and debate, where suddenly all norms and institutions could be publicly questioned. And third, it allowed for the underground circulation of these biting cartoons and caricatures that ruthlessly mocked the royalty and their lavish lifestyles while the common people were out there suffering. Print basically opened up the radical possibility of thinking differently. Let's shift gears to part 4. Print transforms Indian society. So, the momentum over in India kicked off when Portuguese missionaries brought the press to Goa in the mid-16th century, with Catholic priests printing the very first Tamil book in 1579. Fast forward a bit to 1780, and we see the rise of these fiercely independent newspapers. A great example is James Augustus Hickey's English-language Bengal Gazette, a paper that famously loved to gossip about senior East India Company officials. So, from missionary texts to private enterprise to Indian-published papers like Ram Mohan Roy's Sambad Kalmudi, the printing press evolved into this incredibly powerful tool for public discourse. Print very quickly turned into the ultimate battleground for some seriously intense public controversies. Starting in the early 19th century, debates over religious reforms, things like widow emulation and idolatry, were suddenly being hashed out in public, right there in print. It was a lively, heated debate. You had Ram Mohan Roy's reformist newspaper being directly challenged by the Hindu orthodoxy's Samachar Chandrika. At the same time, to counter anxieties about creeping colonial influence, the Islamic Deoband Seminary published thousands of fatwas to guide Muslim readers. And cheap lithographic editions of Hindu texts like Tulsidas' Ramcharitmanas were just flooding the markets. But what's really amazing is that while print absolutely fueled these conflicting opinions, it simultaneously connected distant communities. People were using newspapers to share news from one region to another, which actually helped forge brand new pan-Indian identities. And now for our final section, Part 5, Empowering the Everyday Reader. I want you to consider this absolutely incredible story for a second. In early 19th century East Bengal, there were these deeply conservative beliefs that if a girl learned to read, she would end up widowed. But a young married woman named Rashsundari Devi completely defied those prohibitions. She secretly taught herself to read, hiding in the shadows of her kitchen, and later on she actually wrote and published Amar Jaban in 1876. It was the very first full-length autobiography ever published in the Bengali language. Print literally gave her the power to tell her own story to the entire world. There's this beautiful quote from a woman in a Tamil novel that really hits the nail on the head regarding just how liberating access to the printed word was. For women who were imprisoned at home, intentionally kept in ignorance, or confined by really strict social regulations, books offered an escape route. They were an education and a source of profound, deeply personal happiness. But it wasn't just women. Print also handed a massive megaphone to the lower castes and the working class. Jyotiba Phule wrote Gulamgiri, fiercely protesting the caste system, while leaders like B.R. Ambedkar and Periyar wrote powerfully on caste injustices, and their works were read all over India. And the coolest part? It wasn't just the leaders writing. Everyday workers were engaging with print too. For instance, Kashi Baba, who was a Kanpur mill worker, wrote and published a tract in 1938 that explicitly connected the dots between caste discrimination and class exploitation. By the 1930s, cotton mill workers down in Bangalore were even setting up their very own libraries for self-education. Knowledge was truly, finally, being democratized. But, as history constantly shows us, empowerment almost always provokes a harsh crackdown from those in charge. As vernacular newspapers became more assertively nationalist and started loudly reporting on colonial misrule, the colonial government grew desperate to shut it down. So, they passed the Vernacular Press Act in 1878. Modeled directly on the Irish press laws, it gave the government extensive rights to just censor editorials, and they could even confiscate a paper's printing machinery. This kicked off a brutal cycle of persecution and protest. When the nationalist leader Bal Gangadhar Tilak wrote sympathetically about deported revolutionaries, the authorities imprisoned him in 1908, which, naturally, sparked massive protests all over India. The fight for control over the printing press was quite literally a battle for freedom. And well, that brings us to the end of our explainer today. We've journeyed from ancient Chinese woodblocks all the way to Gutenberg's metal types, from the Protestant Reformation to the French Revolution, and from the secret, quiet studies of women in Bengal to the booming nationalist presses of India. The ripple effect of print literally built our modern world. It completely transformed our relationship to information, to authority, and honestly, to each other. So I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. If the printing press shaped the modern minds by democratizing knowledge, how is the access to and the control of information shaping your reality today?
keep questioning, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me.